Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, February 20th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about the state of Pennsylvania and its Senate race that seems to be getting closer and closer to becoming a likely and safe Democratic state rather than the initially thought of competitive state that this Senate race might have been. Now, Pennsylvania is a state that has been exceptionally close in the past two election cycles. In 2016, Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton here by a margin of just 0.72%. Fast forward 4 years later, and President Biden wins the state by just under 2 points. And so Pennsylvania has been at this sort of center point for Democrats to win back the blue wall, as they would put it. The states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which arguably is one of the most important as the largest electoral prize of the three I just mentioned. Now, Democrats are worried about their chances in 2024, especially when it comes down to these three states. Without them, President Biden has no theoretical pathway to the presidency without some type of major change in the Sunbelt region of the United States. And so the pathway to victory for President Biden very much does lie in a very important state like Pennsylvania. But this video isn't about the presidential race, it is almost entirely about the Senate race. A Senate race, which I had said previously, looks like it's about to become at least likely or safe Democratic from here on moving forward. Now, we've been gracious enough to receive a number of new polls since my last prediction in the beginning of this year. At that point in time, I had Pennsylvania as a pretty competitive state and one that I would have still argued was in the competitive column. But over a sequence of polls and the most recent election results from New York's 3rd District, and of course, the heavy indicators from 2018, 2020, and 2022, Pennsylvania looks like this time around it's going to be a lot better for Democrats, especially when it comes to the Senate race. Now, for a bit of historical context too, Bob Casey has been in the United States Senate since 2006. He was first elected in a blue wave year, which he defeated a Republican incumbent at the time, Rick Santorum, who went on to run for president in both 2008 and 2016, and 2012. What you saw here was that Bob Casey was able to do exceptionally well against many odds, but the version of the year, a blue wave year, I would put it that way, was able to carry him across the finish line pretty tremendously, defeating a Republican incumbent by 17.4%. Now, this didn't obviously come easy, and it certainly didn't come without help. Bob Casey's father, he is a junior, his senior father, had served as a statewide representative for this state in multiple capacities, and a family dynasty and legacy had been built up over the past few decades. And so coming into that 2006 victory, it wasn't shocking to many, but his victory 6 years later probably was. Because Republicans had Bob Casey at the top of their target list in the 2012 Senate elections. Now, I'm sure many of the Senate races you see here are now unrecognizable in today's America, states like West Virginia being solid blue, states like Indiana and Ohio, Missouri being likely or solid blue, all states now where Republicans are pretty much expected to win or have a very good shot at winning in 2024. But Pennsylvania is interesting in that it really hasn't shifted much from what we saw in 2012. Bob Casey won it by 17 and then won it by 9.1%. And so standard political, theory would tell us that in the next election 6 years prior, it would narrow down again. After all, we just saw an 8-point swing from 2006 to 2012. But in 2018 actually, the opposite happened. In 2018, Bob Casey won by 13.1%, an increase from his 2012 margin by around 4 points. Now, the fundamental difference between 2012 and 2018, yes, it was a midterm year, but Bob Casey should have performed worse. Why? Because President Trump had broken this streak of Democratic victories in the state of Pennsylvania that had lasted from 1992 through 2016, when he won the state by 0.7%. After all, in 2012, Obama had won the state by 5.4%. And so Bob Casey's outperformance of 4 points really wasn't all that impressive. But in 2018, he outran where President Trump was and arguably National Democrats were back in 2016 by around 14 points. Because what also coincided with Donald Trump's election victory in Pennsylvania in 2016 was a Senate race. The Democrats lost when Pat Toomey, now no longer in the U.S. Senate, won by 1.4% against Katie McGinty. Now, putting all of that historical context behind, let's take a look at where we are in 2024. Well, I already flashed you the poll here, but you see that Bob Casey is up by roughly 9 points across the state. Now, we remember back in 2020, there were a lot of polls that said the races were going to be a lot better for Democrats than they actually were. But this race in particular doesn't seem to be doing that, at least not with the electorate they're working with. In the same sect of polls here, you find that they also questioned the general election to 1,000 or so regular voters within the state of Pennsylvania. And you find that nearly consistently, with one exception in all of these polls, Joe Biden significantly underperforms Bob Casey, and he outperforms the president dramatically. What I mean here is, for instance, you can take a look at the most recent poll from The Hill and Emerson College that shows Donald Trump with a 2-point advantage in Pennsylvania. A little bit different than what the average is saying here, of Biden being up by roughly a point, but regardless, Trump wins by 2. In the Senate race, though, Bob Casey wins by 10. That's a 12-point swing. Or, for instance, Quinnipiac University, known for their polls in Pennsylvania, showed Biden up by 3 points back in early January. In the same poll, they showed Bob Casey winning by 10. And in another poll that we can see too, with Biden's victory being 1 point from Franklin and Marshall College here. Biden's up by 1, Bob Casey is up by 12. And so the average swing here you're talking about is roughly 11 percentage points across the state. Bob Casey does a tremendous job of outrunning the incumbent president, and it's something that I would say is arguably very, very impressive, regardless of the way you cut it. Now, Republicans are looking at this and saying, there's no reality in which Dave McCormick, the expected Republican nominee here, wins with or gets only 40% of the vote. And in a way, they're right. Even extreme candidates like Doug Mastriano got above 40% of the vote in the state of Pennsylvania, but it wasn't too far off. Now, Bob Casey is an electoral juggernaut. He's had strong election victories in 2006, 2012, 2018, but 2024 might be different. But what the data is suggesting to us is that the voters very much like Bob Casey. What we've seen in approval polls is that he's popular. What we've seen in current polls is that they like him for this election. And what we've seen in elections in these past few years is that Democrats are, in fact, on the up and up when it comes down to Pennsylvania. They now control the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. They now have 2 Democratic senators instead of 1. The House delegation is evenly split from the state, and the 2024 presidential odds are best in Pennsylvania than they are in any other battleground state, from Arizona to Michigan to Georgia, up across the 3-4 corners of this country. Pennsylvania is the best bet for Biden. And so knowing that President Biden is above water in Pennsylvania means that the Senate race, which you have seen Bob Casey consistently outperform Biden by a margin of roughly 11 points on average here. You are seeing this as a major, major victory for Democrats, and one that, as we get closer to November, if it doesn't change between now and maybe September, October, it's probably a state that Republicans are going to abandon in an effort to win over more competitive ones. Because I am often reminded of where we were back in 2022. I remember when Dr. Oz won the Republican primary here, there was all this conversation and concern that Pennsylvania would no longer be a competitive state. And what they found, though, was that with John Fetterman's health issues and questions around whether or not he has the ability to serve in the U.S. Senate, that Dr. Oz did start seeing a bump in polls. But clearly, it wasn't enough. But Republicans never gave up the Senate race because after we got closer to the election, again, with the health concerns being cited by many voters in this state, Pennsylvania seemed a lot more competitive. But in a race where we saw similar polls to the ones we are seeing now in the Senate race, the governor's race is one where Republicans nearly fully pulled out. You found here that the Republican Governors Association and many, many other forms of political action groups across the country pulled out of Pennsylvania on the Republican side. Why? Because right then, Josh Shapiro was polling from the beginning and through the election up by 6, 7, 8 points across the state. Again, this is a state that Biden won by 1 and Trump won by 1, and so it theoretically should have been much more competitive than it actually was. But they read what was going on in this race. They knew this was not a race to invest in. And I'm sure had they invested 10, 20, 30 more $million, the margin might have narrowed up 2 to 3 points. But what does it matter if you're losing anyway? I think that is the mentality that you might see adopted by many mainstream Republicans as we get closer to the election season. Because this Republican primary is not as competitive as it was before. And believe it or not, Dave McCormick actually ran in 2022 and lost to Dr. Oz. Yes, he lost by roughly 1,000 votes or less, but regardless, he lost to Dr. Oz and couldn't unify the party then. And even though he will do it now, it's not without, it's failing, prospects on his side of the aisle. He faces a lot of allegations that he, in a way, is Dr. Oz light. I mean, even taking a look at his filing from the Federal Election Commission, it brings up issue number 1 that Dr. Oz faced in his primary and in the general election. Dr. Oz wasn't from Pennsylvania. He was a multimillionaire from the state of New Jersey who switched over to this state to run with the blessing of Donald Trump. What happened here? He was railed for that. But you know who also isn't from the state of Pennsylvania? Dave McCormick, at which in his filing for U.S. Senate, rather than an address, rather than a normal place, rather than even a home-based office in Pennsylvania. He cites it to a P.O. box, which altogether tells us a story in itself, that he's not from this state. Dave McCormick was railed against running for the U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania largely because he had his home residence in Connecticut. Similar in the way that Dr. Oz was from New Jersey, Dave McCormick was just a little bit more north. And I can imagine, and we've already started seeing it now, I can imagine this becoming a mainstream problem for him in the general election against a political dynasty of Bob Casey and his father and his family that has built up a name and a reputation in the state as electable and liked Democrats for this state. And so now that we are seeing that Dave McCormick has those problems, not only is he from Connecticut, in a similar way to Dr. Oz, I didn't say Dr. Oz light for no reason, he's a rich businessman. Dave McCormick largely was self-funding his campaign in 2022. He also lost in 2022. Voters don't love repeat candidates. While it might matter a little bit more to Republicans than people who never saw his name in the general election, Democrats will make it an issue of the campaign. And again, Bob Casey, who has been vetted and has had his election since 2006, there's not a lot that could actually come up to be a huge problem for the 2024 Senate race in Pennsylvania. Because again, these are some of the most scrutinized individuals across the country. Bob Casey has been a senator for nearly 20 years in one of the most contentious battleground states in the country. And yet, he faces all the odds and is doing tremendously well. Rich businessman, not from the state of Pennsylvania, lost in 2022 and, in a similar way to Dr. Oz, is losing very early on. Now, these early polls are not always the best indicator, but in some cases, and I think in this case, they absolutely can be. When you find that this isn't a problem of just name ID, but rather a problem of a popular Democrat. For instance, the Hill and Emerson College, Joe Biden's at 43%. 49% of voters want Bob Casey. It's not that they're below 40 each way and that nobody knows who they're going to vote for because nobody knows the candidates. The problem is that name ID isn't a problem for Democrats, and the name ID that Bob Casey does have is very liked, very popular, and very good for this election. And I would caution and say that this race is probably not the most competitive one. And so, as I was saying, when we take a look at this competitive map, there will be a reality in which that by the time we reach the election, if numbers are looking the same as they do now in October, even in September, Pennsylvania not only goes off the radar for us as people who are looking at it from a political analysis perspective, but also Republicans who might be more willing to spend that $10 to $20 million in a state like Ohio or Michigan, where they have a much better opportunity at winning. This is one of those states where a strong and tested incumbent can really solidify a state that might otherwise be competitive. This is where you really find the true test of Democratic strength and name ID and a political dynasty in a battleground state. And I have the confidence here to say that Bob Casey will win the Pennsylvania Senate race, seemingly no questions asked at this point. Now, the question that will be followed up with and will be monitored and will be tracked for your viewing and just in general for this election, will Republicans unilaterally disarm in this Senate race, or will they invest in it because of the presidential race that maybe could be benefited by Dave McCormick turning out the vote? What I do think here, though, is that what we will see closer to Election Day is that Republicans will be strapped for resources, especially when it comes down to the Senate. The good thing here for Republicans is that they are playing entirely offense and can win the Senate majority with President Trump winning re-election by, a pretty simple lift, winning Texas. But if they don't win, the presidency, it'll take more than Texas, which means Republicans are going to need to use their money, their resources wisely. They may know that Pennsylvania is competitive on the presidential, but deep down in their hearts in the Senate race, they know that one isn't. Republicans have been trying to defeat Bob Casey for nearly 2 decades now, and I don't think 2024 is going to be it. Even in 2022, when Dr. Oz became the nominee, you found that Democrats won across the state by 4.9%. Against a Democrat who at the time, people weren't certain was going to be serving out a full term in the U.S. Senate. And so I think what it spoke in terms of messaging and honestly just spoke volumes on the Republican Party's inefficiency and inability to win in the state of Pennsylvania in 2022. And the same story can be told in 2020, 2018, and all the elections prior with the involvement of Bob Casey. And I think this election will be no different. So only a matter of time before Pennsylvania moves over into the likely and safe column for Democrats. Arguably at one point it could be seen as blue as Minnesota and Virginia, and I think at that point in time is when Republicans need to start re-strategizing and pretty much pull back resources from Dave McCormick. They disarmed in the primary, never wanted to challenge David McCormick because they genuinely thought that he had a very good shot at victory. But what we are seeing now in these polls and in a lot of other data, whether it's fundraising or national data, that Bob Casey is the Democratic Party's best bet at maintaining the Senate seat, and more likely than not, he does for the Democratic Party and makes the state pretty solid rather than competitive of what it might have been expected to be early on in this election cycle. So good news for Democrats, bad news for Republicans. We will see what they decide to do over the next coming months, but Pennsylvania is certainly one to look out for because Republicans also might spend tens of millions, maybe $100 million in this race, the way Democrats did in South Carolina, all to lose by 9 to 10 points, as we've seen in years past. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist from our 2024 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.